Chapter 12 Battle, Fire, and Plague in England. Charles loses his head. While the English were battling trading posts in India, England itself was in turmoil. James I, the King of England and Scotland, had died, and his son Charles had inherited the throne. But right from the beginning of his reign, Charles started to make the people of England angry. His first mistake was to marry the French princess Henrietta Maria. Henrietta was a beautiful, high-spirited girl, but she was also a devout Catholic who had promised the Pope that she would try to spread Catholicism throughout England. Most Englishmen, especially English Puritans, hated and feared Catholicism. When Charles got ready for his formal coronation ceremony, he was afraid to hold the traditional parade through the streets of London. He thought Puritans might gather along the way and shout out insults. Instead, Charles planned to get to the church by sailing down the Thames River on a barge. But the coronation day was filled with chaos. When it was time for the king and queen to leave the palace, Henrietta refused to come out of her room. She declared that she couldn't attend a Protestant ceremony. When Charles's noblemen tried to force her through the door, Henrietta punched her fists through the glass windows of her room. So Charles went to be crowned all by himself. He paraded out to the Thames, but the royal barge missed its landing and went aground. Charles had to ride in a much smaller boat instead. When he arrived at the church, he tripped at the threshold and nearly fell on his face. When he tried to put on the coronation ring, a large jewel fell out of it and disappeared. Near the end of the ceremony, the archbishop told the gathered crowd to shout, "God save King Charles!" But since most of them didn't hear him, Charles was greeted with silence. And as the ceremony ended, a small earthquake shook England. The troublesome coronation was only the beginning of a troubled reign. Like his father James, Charles believed that God had placed him on his throne, and that his subjects should obey him without question. But Parliament believed that its members, who represented the people of England, should make the laws. When Parliament met after the coronation, it refused to give Charles all of the money he wanted. Charles was furious. He dismissed Parliament and ruled without it for 11 long years. In those years, he fought wars and made laws all by himself. He even told English and Scottish Christians how to worship God. He passed so many restrictions on Puritans that hundreds left England and went to the American colonies. He forced the Scottish Church to use the English prayer book and ceremonies. The Scots hated this English command. In one Scottish church, the minister had to bring 2 loaded pistols with him and point them at the congregation while he read the English prayer book. But while Charles was making the Scots and the English Puritans hate him, he was also running out of money. At the end of 11 years, he was forced to call Parliament back into session to beg for more cash. This Parliament refused to dissolve when Charles became angry. Because it went on meeting for 8 years, it became known as the Long Parliament. The Long Parliament wanted to pass laws that would limit Charles's power, but as time went on, the Long Parliament started to bicker with itself instead. The Puritans and non-Puritans in Parliament spent more and more time arguing about whether or not the Church of England was pure enough. Soon, Parliament was spending most of its time talking about God, not Charles. Charles could see that the Puritan members of Parliament were irritating the other members, so he assembled 500 soldiers and marched into Parliament, hoping to arrest the 5 Puritans who were his fiercest enemies. But the Puritans, warned ahead of time, were gone. Charles and his soldiers faced 5 empty seats. Embarrassed, Charles snapped, "The birds have flown," and strode back to his palace. This was a mistake. When the news spread that Charles was willing to use his English army against other Englishmen in order to get his own way, more and more people turned against him. Charles realized that a rebellion was about to explode all around him. He fled from London and went up to the north of England, where his most loyal noblemen lived. The Puritans in Parliament took control of London. Civil war had begun. For 6 years, Charles's supporters, called Cavaliers, fought against supporters of Parliament, called Roundheads, because of their Puritan haircuts. Charles had most of the regular army on his side, but the Roundheads organized their own army, using the most modern weapons and training methods. This new model army was commanded by the most fervent Puritan of all, Oliver Cromwell. 2 years after the war began, Cromwell helped lead the Roundheads into battle against Charles's soldiers at a place called Marston Moor. 20,000 Scotsmen marched to fight for the Roundheads, because the Roundheads had promised the Scots that, if they won, they could use their own prayer book. Charles's army was defeated. Afterward, Oliver Cromwell wrote to his brother, "Truly England and the Church of God hath had a great favour from the Lord. Give glory, all the glory, to God." This victory was the end of Charles's power. He avoided capture for months, but finally gave up and surrendered. The Roundheads put the king in jail. They had won the Civil War. But Oliver Cromwell was worried. From his prison, Charles was constantly sending messages to his supporters, begging them to rise up and put him back on his throne. The Long Parliament itself wasn't sure what to do with Charles. Many of the non-Puritan members thought that Parliament should make an agreement with Charles and rule alongside of him. Cromwell wanted Charles and his tyranny gone for good. He and the other Puritans marched the new model army into Parliament and drove out everyone who had sympathy for Charles. Only about 60 members were left. This purified Parliament became known as the Rump Parliament because only part of it was left. The Rump Parliament decided that England would only be at peace if Charles were dead. It charged Charles with treason against his own country. A trial was planned. Soldiers were assigned to guard the court from angry supporters of the king. Remembering the gunpowder plot, they searched the cellars. The presiding judge got himself a hat lined with steel just in case someone might try to shoot him. When Charles was brought into the court, he refused to answer any questions, but plenty of witnesses testified against him. The said Charles Stuart, announced the court, trusted with a limited power to govern for the good and benefit of the people, hath traitorously and maliciously levied war against the present Parliament and the people therein represented. Much innocent blood of the free people of this nation hath been spilt. The court declared Charles guilty and led him away. 3 days later, on January 30th, 1649, the King of England was led out of his jail toward a scaffold built in the centre of London. The morning was dark and cold. As he walked toward the black-draped scaffold, drums beat mournfully. Charles climbed up and took off his cloak, handing it to an official who stood nearby. "Wait until I give you the sign," he said to the executioner. "Yes, your Majesty," the executioner answered. Charles put his head on the block. "I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown," he said. In a moment, he stretched his hand to the executioner, who swung his axe. Some of the people who crowded around were weeping, others cheered. The executioner held up Charles's head. "This is the head of a traitor," he shouted out. For the first time in 1,000 years, no king ruled in England.